Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for our ongoing series, Speaking of Schools. I'm Sharon Kirsch. I'm the co-founder and director of research for Save Our Schools Arizona Network, and we are a statewide grassroots nonprofit dedicated to research, community engagement, and outreach around the importance of supporting and prioritizing public education in Arizona. So I am, for those of you who are watching via Facebook Live, thank you for joining us. You can put some questions in the chat, which we will try to get to best we can. So I want to start today. I'm really honored to introduce our guests as we explore opposition to ESA vouchers. So first of all, I'd like you to meet Dr. Joshua Cohen, who's a professor of education policy at Michigan State University. He was the co-founder and co-director of the Education Policy Innovation Collaborative from 2016 to 2020. His current research focuses on teacher quality, student and teacher mobility, and evaluations of state and local education programs. So in addition to publishing scholarly work in scholarly journals, Josh also publishes in lots of national media outlets, and this is what caught our eye, a recent piece that he published in the Heckinger Review, and it's called "After 2 Decades of Studying Voucher Programs, I'm Now Firmly Opposed to Them." So we have lots to talk about with Josh. And next, I would like to introduce you to Amy Pedato. She is the proud mom of 2 daughters, one of whom attends a private school using an ESA voucher due to a disability diagnosis. Amy works with the Grand Canyon Institute, which is a nonpartisan think tank that provides fact-based research on policies that affect economic, fiscal, and the social future of Arizona. So the Grand Canyon Institute also focuses on public education funding, the cost of private school subsidies, and charter school transparency and accountability. And as the director of research at Save Our Schools, I rely on their research and very much appreciate it. So for those of you who are new in our audience to the idea of vouchers and maybe with what's going on in Arizona, I just want to remind you that for the past 2 decades, Arizona has really been the petri dish for developing the kind of public school privatization that we call ESAs. So in Arizona, that stands for Empowerment Scholarship Accounts. In other states, they're often called an education savings account. And so in 2012, when Arizona's ESA program began, it was pitched to everybody as a very small program that would be just for kids with very highly specialized needs beyond what the public schools could serve. What happened in practice, so that was the theory. What happened in practice is that our ESA program expanded incrementally year after year after year until 2017, when the legislature passed an almost universal ESA voucher program. And Save Our Schools came into being. We were just 6 really angry moms and could not understand why they would expand this program that would take public dollars out of our public schools when our public schools are at the bottom of the barrel for state funding. And we have some of the highest class sizes in the country. We have very high student to counselor ratios. And so it just didn't make any sense to us that they would be expanding this program. So we referred that bill to the ballot in 2018, and voters across Arizona agreed with us by an enormous 2-to-1 margin. Voters said, no, we do not want to expand this voucher program. So very sadly, 5 years later, we find ourselves in a similar situation, and we are fighting once again another very bad, truly universal ESA voucher bill that would allow all kids in Arizona to have access to a voucher. And in Arizona, our vouchers are unaccountable, not transparent, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So that's some history. So we are in the middle of yet another signature gathering campaign. You can learn more about that on our website. But now I want to turn to Professor Cowan, and to talk a little bit about his research. And I think, would you just start, Josh, by talking to us a little bit? A lot of the people who are involved in the Save Our Schools network are new, or were new 5 years ago, to education policy. We've been sort of autodidacts, teaching ourselves, trying to learn about this. So will you tell us a little bit about your how you even came to approach studying vouchers as a scholar and an academic?
Yeah, sure. And thanks. It's really great to be here. Really appreciate the work you guys are doing, and grateful to be chatting with all of you tonight. Just very briefly, so education policy is a very broad field, and it's a combination of folks who work in stakeholder communities, academics, for government, for think tanks, and all of everybody sort of trying to contribute knowledge to kind of the way that public entities operate and educate. And you've got economists and political scientists and sociologists and psychologists. I mean, it's a very interdisciplinary group of folks. At its core, and this is sort of where my work comes in, I mean, there's been this movement over the last 25 years or so. It started at the federal government, but some states have taken the lead too. Places like Texas, oddly enough, and Tennessee and North Carolina, and some others, in just kind of trying to impose a bit more of a science and structure to evaluating public education programs, and not simply because they're public, but because they're these large programs, and applying everything from the techniques and principles of lab science, biomedicine and things, randomized control trials, for example, in education. If we've got, say, curriculum, pedagogy, vouchers. Actually, a lot of what we know in the early years of vouchers came from basically what amounts to a randomized clinical trial of vouchers, because a lot of these programs started through a lottery, where scholarships were distributed on a lottery basis. And when you have a lottery and it's randomized, and it's truly randomized, it can mimic the way that sort of laboratory settings that researchers use to test, say, pharmaceutical drugs. So in that broad framework, most colleges of education have some form of an education policy academic department, where education researchers who sort of locate themselves in the academic community go, and I'm one of those people. Most of us also work in some way. So I work with a fair number of school districts, state agencies. I worked with state agencies all over the country, and the federal government. Right now, I'm on the advisory board for the evaluation of Washington, D.C.'s federally funded voucher program. So it's exactly the same program essentially as what you have in Arizona, except it's contained in the District of Columbia. When Congress, and it's the only federally funded voucher program, when Congress reauthorized that program, it stuck an auditing or an evaluation component to it. And if evaluation sounds like a fancy word, just think about it as auditing, essentially how it works, who participates, what the outcomes are, performance measurement, everything that you don't have in the Arizona program. Right. Congress, in its wisdom or folly, however you want to look at it, is required every time it's reauthorized its voucher program it to have basically an audit or an evaluation. I'm kind of on the supervisory board of that group there. So that's a lot of what education policy folks do. And it's we move back and forth between this center that you mentioned that I started. It's a partnership with the state Department of Education, and they have a program they need evaluated or studied, they go to that center. And so it's through that lens that I kind of approached vouchers almost 17 years ago, when the city of Milwaukee had its voucher program renewed by the state legislature. At the time, Milwaukee's voucher program, also very similar in structure to what's in Arizona, but contained at the time in Milwaukee. At the time it was reauthorized in 2005, it also added an evaluation component. And joining that research team, I teach a lot of statistics. So a lot of the stuff is like how applying statistical techniques to measurement and things to these programs. And so folks like that are in short supply, and you join them. And so I didn't come into this area, say from an advocacy or activist position, I was in to essentially help the state government do what amounted to a performance review of that program. And through that, it just has I've spent the last 15, 17 years doing that, places like New Orleans and other places as well. So
So
now,
oh, I'm sorry.
No,
One of
that's
the
it.
things you mentioned in the Heckinger report article that you wrote is that you said when you started out this research on vouchers, you were cautiously optimistic that they could help, that they might be a solution.
Yeah,
So talk a little bit about that and how that changed, or.
Sure. I mean, vouchers have been as an idea in place since the 60s, right? So Milton Friedman, who started this think tank called Ed Choice, was a famous economist, kind of came up with this idea in the 60s. But it wasn't until 1990 that vouchers were put in place on a very limited pilot basis in Milwaukee. And we didn't know, and so as I was trained as a policy analyst, and my PhD is actually in political science, not in sort of education. And so you come into something like that in much the same way that an accounting firm might come in and examine books, and they don't necessarily come in with a prior if you ask me now, I come in with a prior, obviously, sort of because I've been doing this for so long and I know how this looks and how this works. But at the time, you come in and you sort of say, well, okay, I mean, there's some decent schools, and maybe sending some of these kids who think they need them might we're going to see what it looks like, essentially. And because in those very early periods of time, so what you do when you come onto an evaluation program like this is you read what other people did before you, and the limited number of sort of looks under the hood of the small number of voucher programs existed, there was it looked like there might be some positive sort of test scores resulting from the kids who actually moved to those programs, which were tiny amount, like less than 1,000 in some cases, which is trivially small relative to who attends these things today. But when I started doing this work was really around the pivot point. It just happened to be around the pivot point almost exclusively since then, over the last 12, 15 years, and really 2009, 10, 11, that time period, about a decade or so ago, we've seen some of the largest negative impacts on student outcomes that we've ever seen in the education research community across any research domain. I mean, not just vouchers or charter schools or school choice or anything. I mean, it's really hard to get test scores to drop as far as we've seen vouchers dropping them since they've gone statewide in places like Louisiana, Ohio, Indiana, DC, now Arizona. I don't know what's going to happen in Arizona because you guys don't have the kind of audit requirements that they do, at least in some of the other states. So we'll see. But you can't be anything but an ideologue at this point to look at the pattern of results. I mean, they're almost undeniable. And for those of you who are listening, you might notice that nobody on the voucher side of things anymore, these people pushing this stuff, talks about how great test scores are anymore. And the reason is that not even they can deny that these programs have been extraordinarily harmful to the children who use them. We're not even talking about public schools yet, just the children who take a voucher to go into the schools. We're talking about a pandemic level. The only two sort of events or policy interventions that we've seen with test scores as negative as the vouchers have caused recently, especially in Louisiana, but elsewhere as well, are Hurricane Katrina and the pandemic itself. I mean, you have to get to that level of disaster to approach the level of decline that vouchers have led to in student learning for kids who use them. It's hard to ignore.
Wow. Oh my gosh. So let's come back to that, but I'd like to turn to Amy at this point. And one of the things that we hear in Arizona a lot is parents know what's best for their kids. There's, parents should have the right to choose. So Amy, as a parent with 2 kids in schools in Arizona, will you talk just a little bit about your experience with that?
So I'll start by saying we were in two great districts, both K-12 and K-8 and high school. My older daughter remains in the district system. My younger daughter was in a district school through 4th grade and had great teachers. And I think it was class size that ultimately it was so difficult for her that we had to pull her out because it was overwhelming and leading to issues and so forth. So because of her diagnosis, we were able to get an ESA and we placed her in a private school that is geared towards kids with learning differences. So very grateful for that. But I think I also, given the work that I do and just my concern about this issue, I think about it in a more of a global scale. I think, we talk about parents' right to choose, but if this voucher program goes into place and those who are pushing it are ultimately successful, we'll see Arizona's public system collapse, and then parents will no longer have a right to choose. It will be the schools that are choosing the students. And not only that, but our local, we talk about our local neighborhood schools and it sounds nice. You think about families gathering around and so forth. That's nice. But what's really important is students have a right to go to that school. Students that live in those boundaries have a right to attend that school. So it's important for all kids, but also as a mom of a child with a disability, kids with disabilities have a right to go to that school and to access services. Now, it might not be perfect, but they have a right to fight too for the services their child needs, and that will go away. So this bill will take away ultimately the right of parents and students to enroll their child in a school. And that's what terrifies me.
Yeah. And, Arizona, even prior to vouchers coming in 2012, we have lots of school choice where we have open enrollment. We have charter schools, more charter schools per capita than any other state. And so there's already a lot of choice for parents. And I think, like you said, the thing that upsets me the most about this latest attempt to expand vouchers universally, even before I knew about the data and the information that Josh is giving us, is that we already know that the vast majority of people in Arizona choose that school right down the street for a variety of reasons. Many times because it's the only one they can get their kid to, right? Like it's,
Right.
And you want to have that connection to your neighborhood and walk to school with the neighborhood kids. And that I think is in serious peril if this massive voucher expansion goes into effect. And this, go ahead, Amy.
We spoke about this the other day, that from the disability perspective, only about 7,000 kids with disabilities are using ESAs. Well, there are 145,000 kids with disabilities in the public school system. Arizona has had ESAs for kids with disabilities for 11 years now, and we only have 7,000 kids using ESAs. That should tell you something. Importantly, private schools haven't flocked to the market to serve these kids in spite of those ESAs. There's not a market response to this. So the people who are pushing this aren't pushing it for kids with disabilities. They're not pushing it for these other categories that they've incrementally expanded ESAs for. They're pushing it for the kids whose families can afford to pay more than the $7,000 that it will require for a quality private education.
Right.
So,
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and if I could just jump on that too, we should distinguish in some of the states that I mentioned. There are voucher-like programs for students with disabilities, and there are a number of there's been some research on those programs, and with some mixed results. But I tend to, at least in my way of thinking about this, I tend to think of it a little bit differently in that group of folks. Certainly agree that there's not been a market response at all for serving those folks, in part because it's expensive to do. And if you've got either a for-profit model or you are trying to accrue some sort of rainy day funds at your school, it doesn't make a lot of economic sense to do it. It's just sort of the cold hard reality of it. But it's also not about it. Like there isn't a strong there's not the sort of activist activity around that issue as there are around sort of more the religious education side of things. But Sharon, I think it was you that you said that there are a number of kids also choosing. So I'm beaming into y'all from Michigan, and we have the same sort of thing here. 1 in 4 kids, which is almost exactly the same proportion of folks in your state. 1 in 4 kids here already attend a public school outside their residential area, either a charter school or through interdistrict choice, so moving to a nearby district for whatever reason. That's almost 250,000 kids here do that, and our funding system is one where the dollars follow those kids, and there are winners and losers in that funding system already. And this isn't a podcast about that. We could talk about that some other time, but it has benefited a lot of public schools, and it has really harmed a lot of public schools. But regardless of its impact on public schools, it remains true that sort of state aid, state funding follows the kid here in Michigan. The only thing it doesn't do is go into private schools yet. They're trying to do some ends around our electoral system too to get that voucher program, which is just like they sort of did in your state. But the point is, kids already can choose, and the reason that there's this emphasis that we need to give parents the ability to choose the right place for their children is that sounds really good, right? I mean, most of us don't necessarily conceptually disagree with the idea that parents do know their children, right? And they need to be able to think. Amy was talking about the decisions they made, and we want that to happen. Well, the thing is, it within the public sector, it already does happen in Arizona. It already does happen in Michigan. It already does happen in all but a very, very small number of states. And most of these are very tiny states in the first place. The question is, should those tax dollars go fund religious education? And even if it's not a religious education, some type of private education that we don't really, we have no real oversight on. We have no idea where those tax dollars are going. I mean, I'm old enough, I'm fairly young, but I'm old enough to remember when conservatives were the party of fiscal responsibility, where we wouldn't just, just throw a whole bunch of money at an outside vendor without accountability, without performance assessment. And that's basically the name of the game here in these voucher organizations. And I guess the last thing I'll say, and then I'll sort of shut up, but I worry. We jumped around this issue 10 years ago before voucher programs became, I mean, they were always a political question, but they weren't as overtly a political question as they've become now. And at this point, I mean, you don't know what's in an individual parent or person's heart, right? But as a matter of the groups involved with these organizations, these organizations are all aligned with things like election denialism, with anti-LGBTQ, with other kinds of discriminatory activities. I just saw today a charter school was shut down because it was being run elsewhere, not in Arizona. It was being run by a polygamy organization. We're talking about some extreme sets of values that don't sort of even fit within sort of the kinds of sort of typical ways of thinking about kind of legal, moral, and ethical behavior. And anytime this word values gets dumped into the conversation, that's where I start to worry, because what ends up happening is it's sort of being used as code in these arguments for, we want to be able to take our kids to schools that are going to discriminate against certain kids. Indiana has a large statewide voucher program. It's already been under investigation for denying admission to and expelling kids who are out and identify as gay, for example. In Milwaukee, where I worked 10 years ago, there was a long-standing Department of Justice federal investigation in the city's voucher program because it had suspiciously low numbers of students with special needs and disabilities enrolled in those programs. So it's not just even on the issue of sexuality. We're talking about any kid that the school doesn't want. And that's to this point about who these kids, who gets enrolled. I mean, at the end of the day, these programs are by definition exclusive and in their worst cases discriminatory. And we see this, I mean, in the research too, when an oversight or enrollment guidelines are put in the state programs that do require voucher schools, if they take public money, to accept anyone they have room for, up to 70% of vouchers of private schools decline to participate in that voucher program because they don't want to have to admit anybody. And so they walk away from the program. And that's usually used in the activist community as a argument against government involvement. But it's not the win that they think that it is, because what it shows, that information shows, is in fact, most of these private schools have absolutely no intention of taking any kid that comes to their front door. They want to be able to pick their enrollment. And as I think it was Amy who said, this very quickly doesn't become about parent choice. It becomes about the schools choosing their kids.
Exactly. And I think your point about discriminatory actions on the part of schools, like we absolutely have seen that in Arizona, and we are in the midst of watching Turning Point Academy come into our West Valley, and it's a very, very extreme homophobic, it's private at this point, but if the voucher program goes through, our tax dollars would be going to support very extreme points of view, and that's not where I want my tax dollars going. And of course, Amy, do you want to talk a little bit about how what you have to do when you take your child out of the public school and put them in a private school, what sort of rights you have in both settings?
So as I mentioned earlier, like within the public setting, my daughter had an IEP, which afforded her certain rights. So we had rights to her receiving based on their evaluation of her. She had speech therapy and some accommodations and so forth. And I was in a situation where I had a great relationship with the school and we worked well together. But when we accepted the ESA, I had to sign, I believe it's called an attestation, saying that I was pulling my daughter from the public school system, that we would no longer be using, enrolling her in a public school, and that then we enrolled her in the private. In doing that, she doesn't have any rights in the private school. Mm-hmm. I'm really pleased to say that we're attending a nonprofit, non-sectarian school that's committed to serving kids with learning disabilities, but we don't have any rights. And if something were to go horribly wrong, they could make her leave. Mm-hmm. And we have no recourse. So that would be the case for all kids. Right. And again, going back to what I said earlier, and there would be, if the people behind this are successful and we end up privatizing Arizona's education system, there will be no school that a child has a right to attend.
Right. I think that's a really, really important point, because we already see in Arizona kids who have gone to micro schools, or kids who have gone even to charters or to private schools. When they leave, they come back to the public schools in their neighborhoods. And
we need to think about how disruptive that is. Right. I mean, so we have so much choice, but that also means that you see parents moving their child from school to school to school.
Yes.
That's disruptive. What we do have, particularly in the district school system, is parents have the right to get involved. I mean, we can vote for our governing board members. We can go to governing board meetings and voice our opinion. We can band together with other parents and make our voices heard. We have a right to contribute and influence how the schools are run. With private schools, that's out the door. Like, you can try, but they're not obligated to listen to you. So again, and I have talked to many families for kids moving from school to school to school.
I want to press on this too, because it's, when you're working, you guys all know this, but when you're sort of working in a policy environment or political environment, you don't have the luxury of necessarily completely disengaging with folks from the other side, right? You have to talk to some of these people when you're trying to influence policy. And one of the things that I just can't get over is on their own terms, these things are pretty awful for parents for just the reasons that Amy's describing. I mean, it's being pitched as this is all about empowering parents. But in fact, in a fully privatized environment, or even an environment where public schools are having to compete in some way with a strong private sector, that ultimately is really disempowering for parents. And, you know, education is one of those things that it's very difficult, even for, I mean, I have been doing this for a really long time, and I don't know what makes a good school necessarily, right? Like we have a lot of different opinions about that. And my children, I have teenagers, have been a parent of school age children for a really long time. I couldn't necessarily tell you, right? Like it's hard to pick the right school. From some, I mostly do statistics, pieces in the evaluative work I do, but I work a lot with qualitative researchers who interview parents and interview policymakers. When we've been in New Orleans, one of the most stressful things that parents will identify, and in New Orleans, it's a free-for-all. I mean, they can choose public, private, charter across the board and all on the same application. But it's a really stressful thing for parents because what if they get it wrong, right? And because it is disruptive to shop your kid from place to place to place. It's not like picking fast food at a restaurant or taking a test drive on a car. Although I will say, even on that analogy, none of us would buy a car without test driving it, right? And yet the way these private school programs are set up, you don't get a chance to test drive the school. And if you have any idea, I mean, you said that you moved your daughter after fourth grade, Amy, but that was several years, right, of working with the school system. It takes a long time to figure out what's going on. And the way this model is set up in these environments is just as if you're shopping for a car, except you don't get to test drive it. You have to get in the car and drive away with it. And at worst, you're putting your kid in the car and having them drive away with it because you're not there to help them during the day. Really, at the end of the day, you're not there. And that's the really hard part. And it's just on their own terms. These things are not about empowering parents. They're about privatizing and undermining faith in civic institutions. I mean, honestly, I think that's really what we're talking about here.
But, and then to build on that though, parents there will be no academic accountability or financial accountability within those schools. So it'll be word of mouth or some slick marketing materials from the private school, and they'll have no idea. So, and I think this is really important. Parents who receive ESAs have to report how the funding's used. The private schools don't have to report how they use the tuition that they receive. So you'll have no idea how much of that money is being invested in the kids and how much is being taken out as profit. So, which goes back to being disempowering. Like, how will, it sounds nice and shiny and cool, but in reality, like, would you buy a car before doing some research? No, probably not. Well, and you want reliable information. Parents won't have that.
How far does it, even things like gas mileage, right? How far does it go on one tank of gas? Like, we can't answer any of those similar questions about private schools under any of these environments. And you know, that's in the best case scenario too. Then you can get to the worst case scenario. So we have our immediately former speaker of our state house is a guy named Lee Chatfield, who for about 5 minutes had some national spotlight on him because he was one of the leaders from the state government that Trump brought to the Trump Hotel and the White House to try to convince to send a false set of electors during the 2020 election. Well, Chatfield is now under serious investigation because he came out of, his father still runs a private school up north here in the northern part of our state. And this school is under serious investigation, as is the former speaker himself, for alleged abuse of some of the children there. And under the plan that's being proposed here, which is modeled on the plan that was put in place in Arizona, we would have actually no way to check how public money is being spent at that school that's under investigation. We'd have no way to pull money back from that school until the investigation was resolved. We'd have no money of checking how the dollars were being spent at that school on the investigation, if it helped pay for any of the alleged field trips that some of this abuse happened on, if it helped pay for the salaries of the people, for the lawyers defending the school. I mean, any of these things. And so that's like the worst case. I mean, the scenario where everything's going okay and there's not like malevolent intent and it's just people trying to educate kids who don't know how to necessarily run an institution, like that's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario, all of these things, all these potential for sort of abuse, for fraud, for criminal behavior, all of those things that the public school sector, I mean, people are people, but there are significant checks and balances on these things. And you hear about, I work very closely with our teachers professional associations here, and you hear some of the teacher groups in our state are always talking about a teacher who comes to work drunk, or who, has their contract protects them from getting fired or anything. I mean, like, the ultimate lack of accountability is a school voucher system. I mean, this is take the money and run by design.
Yes. Well, and I think as your research points out, Josh, you don't have any research on Arizona because there's no data. We know how many kids are on ESA and what category they come from. There is a system to track how some of the money's spent, but there's zero academic accountability.
Right.
We just don't know.
And I know that I think it's if a school has something like 50 or more kids, they have to take a test and give, but there's no actual, there's a difference between sort of requiring some participation, and most private schools actually also administer a test. That's not the question. The question is it subject to any sort of review, analysis, and independent stuff, right? I mean, that's the real problem. And also just, I don't know the percentages, none of us know, but I can tell you that in Milwaukee, for example, and in New Orleans, you don't have a lot of private schools that take like 2 voucher kids. What ends up happening is you get these schools that are almost entirely made up of voucher kids, or the school just declines to participate. So places like Louisiana, there are dioceses, Catholic dioceses will pick and choose which schools they're going to allow to participate in the voucher program. And then those schools become full voucher kids, which means they become fully publicly funded. And so we're not talking about just like the inconvenience of a school having to administer a test to 2 of their kids who are on scholarship. We're talking about a fully public private school. These are the same people, these voucher advocates who for decades were pushing to test and hold public schools accountable, and who pushed, by the way, holding teachers accountable, and removing teachers for poor classroom performance on metrics. I mean, if individual teachers, or if public schools performed as poorly as the voucher programs have been performing in state after state after state, these people would have been screaming to fire those teachers and shut those schools down. In fact, there are many laws on the books to close schools with performance half as bad as the voucher programs we've seen. Oh, I can't hear you.
Let me get to another point that you brought up in the article, Josh, and that is one of the things that we've seen in Arizona is, and especially when this latest bill was working its way through the legislature, people in support of universal voucher expansion were calling it the civil rights issue of our time, and saying that it was for, really geared toward low-income kids and kids of color. And in your article, you said that vouchers actually fail to deliver for kids who are often the most in need. And so tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, most of these programs, other than Arizona, still remain in some way a means-tested program. So what that means is simply there's an income cap on participation in most of these places. And that's done for a couple of reasons. One is that it's just it's a foot in the door. I mean, the idea. So what happens is these programs begin as low income programs, and then they expand and expand and expand and expand until they become universal. That's been the model for establishing them. But the language has all been couched in terms of helping poor people, and in some cases explicitly helping students of color, and even in some cases more explicitly helping Black children. And if anybody knows anything about civil rights and education history, right, sort of the idea of inequitable schools for students of color, but particularly for Black kids in the South, this has been a part of a blight on our nation's history. And so in really kind of, I mean, it's really staggering how bold some of the activists have been in sort of appropriating the language of civil rights, appropriating the language of freedom, You hear about educational freedom all of the time. And the idea is to sort of whittle away people who might be doubtful about whether or not this is bad stuff, right? It's not designed for the true believers who want government out of everything and who are going to send their kids to private school no matter what. Even if they go in debt for the rest of their lives, they're going to keep their kids out of the public school system. This language is not designed for those parents. The language is designed for suburban parents who may have positive or negative or lukewarm experiences with the schools, who think it makes some sense to move tax dollars around, who pay property taxes, who might have even, maybe even sympathetic to the language of poor school performance and for children of color. That's not what the goal here is, but the language is intentionally explicitly calling language of, everybody from Donald Trump to Mike Pence to Betsy DeVos to conservative writers, columnists have used that phrase, the civil rights issue of our time. And that's not an accident. It's not, I mean, some of it is, frankly, and I say this as a white man, some of it is white male grievance. It was sort of this idea that like the pendulum has swung away from sort of, it used to be that you could be simply by being white and being a man in this country, everything was you could walk between the raindrops. And so there is a little bit of that language. It's sort of intended to be speaking to people who sort of believe that they have the right to move their tax dollars around wherever they want to. There's a little bit of that, but most of it is just marketing. Most of it is just taking language and confusing the issue and making it sound like, well, maybe it's not so bad. I mean, this is why they're called anything that diverts public money, taxpayer dollars, into a private school tuition plan, whether it's through a tax expenditure like in Arizona, or through just a direct check that the state makes to a school. It's a voucher. I mean, that's what it is. There's no dispute. When you get a flight canceled from Delta, they call it a travel voucher. You get on a plane, they say you can take it tomorrow, you can take a flight next week, you can take it anywhere in the continental United States. It's called a voucher. It's exactly what all of these plans do, but they can't use that word anymore like they could 17 years ago when I began this stuff, because it polls really poorly. So now you get opportunity scholarships, you get empowerment scholarships, you get Educational Freedom Act, things like this. It's all designed to make it sound like a much better thing than it actually is. I mean, that's not black helicopter conspiracy theory stuff. This stuff is just out there in the public sort of dialogue. It's just, you have to look for it.
And I think you're right. It's very, very much by design. The people pushing this universal voucher bill trotted in an African-American pastor who is connected to the American Federation for Children, Betsy DeVos's group. And, so it's definitely part of their strategy. But we also found in Arizona a couple of years back, actually, it's maybe been about 5 years ago, the Arizona Republic did a study and found that in practice, most people who use ESA vouchers are comparatively well off and in suburbs. So, Amy, were you going to jump in?
Yeah, just if you don't mind some numbers. So we definitely see that that the vouchers are being pitched towards lower income families, so they have the freedom to choose a private school. But if they were really sincere about investing in kids from lower income communities, they wouldn't be offering them $7,000, because it will cost a lot more than that to provide a quality education to these kids. So, and just to put some numbers around it, in the 2019-2020 school year, which was the last time I could find it, data for this, 55% of school children, K-12 school children in Arizona were eligible for the free and reduced lunch program. So that's an indication of level of economic disadvantage. So over half, and that was prior to the pandemic. Now, over the past 2 legislative sessions, we've had historic surpluses in this state. If the state was truly interested in helping to provide more quality education and interventions for kids in lower socioeconomic communities, they would have taken that surplus money and provided a meaningful opportunity rate. We had something approved this legislative session I couldn't find today. I think it's maybe $150 per student. I'm not sure, But that's nothing. That doesn't even scratch the sides. The Grand Canyon Institute, in the research that we did, suggested an opportunity weight between $872 and $1,700. But even that we know is low. Those numbers basically are acknowledging that in Arizona that the chances of getting anything higher are slim. There's no way that $7,000 is going to provide a child from a low-income community a quality private school education. So to me, it's all about cost shifting, and it will benefit families from higher income, with higher incomes, to be able to take advantage of this. And that will leave lower income kids struggling in the public system that will continue to be kneecapped.
And remember, just sort of combining everything that Amy just said with what I said earlier about the effect size of these programs for the kids who do make it in, right? So the best case scenario here again is one of these low income kids does find a way to get into one of these school systems. And if the research in other states, in Louisiana, Indiana, Ohio, and DC, are at all any sort of guide, then that child is getting promised a high quality education and is going to a program or to a school where on average you see declines in learning on par with Hurricane Katrina or the pandemic itself. So that's kind of what I was trying to get at, where that's the best case scenario, right? And it should be criminal, but it's not. I mean, we have truth in advertising laws in a lot of states that prevent this from, if you buy a product that's a faulty product transparently, there are in certain instances that company making that product could get sued, but not here, right? Like, and we're talking about kids' lives and their education, their growth, their development as people. It's a fraud. I mean, I don't want to kind of overstate it, because I'm trying to kind of think also and clearly in terms of the research and the numbers, but this is what's going on. It's not a product that is worth buying, and it's even worse so for, though I like to tell my graduate students, the thing about education policy is it's a hard field to work in. We do know, though, that when policies work, they tend to work less well for the most disadvantaged kids. And when policies work poorly, they tend to work worst of all and to hurt most of all those same disadvantaged kids. So this is what we have with the vouchers is a classic example of the latter, except we've just never seen anything as bad as this. You've got a program that generally is a bad idea. It doesn't work very well. It takes money from private schools. Oh, and in its most successful sense, when you do manage to get a low-income kid whose parents do move them there because they are trying to create educational opportunity for their kid, they go there, and on average, their kid's going to suffer substantial and maybe irreparable learning loss. And it's a shame, and all for the purpose of undermining public schools.
That's very, very sobering. And it's frustrating for us at Save Our Schools Arizona, because we know, because we're on the ground, we truly are a grassroots organization. We talk to people all over the state. We talk to people from all political parties, and the vast majority of people in Arizona want us to have a great public school system. And so the people who are pushing these vouchers are really a small group but sadly, they're very, very well funded.
I wanted to make sure I jumped on that real quick too, and I'm watching the clock, but that was one sort of, I had a list of a few things I wanted to talk to listeners about, and but that last one was exactly this. Like, nobody's actually asking for this, and sort of there's not this groundswell, right? I mean, partly because there already is substantial school choice, like we both Amy and I mentioned, but also because this is a small group of people. It's just that they're also a very loud group and a very well-funded group of people. And then the other thing, this point about bipartisan, this is true almost everywhere. So it's not even necessarily a widely held position sort of on the conservative side of the aisle. This is stereotypically a politically conservative program, vouchers are. But I mean, in my state, and I know in other states like Oklahoma, and Texas, there's substantial skepticism, and rightfully so, among some of our rural leaders and rural legislators who otherwise identify as pretty strict conservatives, because public school systems were in the areas that they represent and the areas they lead are foundational to the communities that they work in and that they represent at the state capitol. We're not just talking about teachers in classrooms. And I think that sometimes we forget that as educators, and I am one, right? That we're talking about like homecoming parades and football games and 4-H clubs and 4th of July parades and car washes and all of the things that go into making a public school a community school. Those are the kinds of things that folks who may not agree with everything that we're saying on this call, in this conversation, still value in their communities. And that's why there's a lot of skepticism, even for folks who, again, probably would disagree with 9 out of 10 things 4 of us have said. They still are not in favor of vouchers because they understand that there's some value apart from the academics that public school communities provide. In a lot of cases, at least in our state, and I know this is true elsewhere, in many of our rural communities, public school system is by far the largest employer. So if nothing else, we're talking about a major economic argument for keeping the public school system in place that even folks who identify as strictly politically or ideologically conservative strongly value.
Absolutely. We just did a report not too long ago looking at rural schools in Arizona, and of course found that very much to be the case. So we are coming up on the end of our time. Amy, would you like to add anything else to the conversation before we wrap it up?
Actually, there was one thing. So this morning I was out outside a school gathering signatures off of school property. And I was talking to a gentleman, hey, would you like to sign this petition regarding private school vouchers? And he was like, sure. He said, I used to be a special education teacher. And so we had a chat, and I was talking to him about specific concerns. And he said, what really bothers him is the length of time that Arizona's public school system has been underfunded.
Yes.
And so Arizona's public schools aren't failing. Our elected leaders have failed to fund our public schools. And I think we have to be really clear that that has probably been intentional to put us in this situation where we do have some frustration at times, but we have to understand. So again, I looked at some numbers. So average per pupil funding in Arizona is around $8,700, where the national average is $14,500. And I think people who are thinking about this, if you're waiting or if you're not quite sure, absolutely think about that. Our schools are so horribly underfunded. And that is all part of this plan, I believe.
Yes, it is.
By design, yeah.
Yep,
Mhm.
by design. So any other parting comments, you two?
I would just say, it's difficult to overstate. You can see like how passionate I am about this subject, and it's difficult to overstate the negative consequences of these programs. And the other side, the side that's sort of working very hard to establish them, not just in Arizona but across the country, is very, very, very good at muddying up the issue and confusing the issue and making it sound reasonable. Making extreme positions sound reasonable and seem like they're grounded in opportunity, in data. And that's sort of how I got involved. Is it's very easy for me to look at this stuff and say, no, this is absolutely misuse of this stuff. But the facts are available. They're available from organizations like yours, for both of you. They're available on sort of the pieces I write. They're available on the web in most cases. It's not easy. It's not difficult to find out how bad these things are, but you have to do it. And then I would just sort of re-echo what Amy said about sort of the public schools. We know at this point how important money is. It sounds like a really obvious thing, but for 30 years, education researchers were arguing about how valuable money was to public schools. There's been whole books called like Does Money Matter? And actually sort of among sort of fairly highly credentialed, highly respected conservative scholars, some of whom have worked in Arizona, have been leaders on pushing forward this idea that money didn't matter. And that's no longer of any sort of doubt. We know beyond any sort of doubt how important money is. We have a study actually just came out a couple of months ago from the University of Michigan, my counterparts down there, that found that when Michigan substantially increased its funding base, and somewhat ironically, the same year and part of the same package of education reforms that it also created charter schools, but substantially increased its funding base over time. The districts that had the biggest jumps in funding, not just had the biggest jumps in things like test scores and graduation rates, and they did, but also quality of life changes. For example, crime rates went down in those districts. Long-term stuff, not just over 1 year, but over 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years. We're talking about holistic quality of life improvements when you fund public education. And that's not no one of any sort of seriousness is debating or disputing that anymore, unless they're directly trying to undermine public schools for their own purposes.
If I could add on that, ASU put out a research paper in 2020, the Office of the University Economist, and it goes through and it talks about income tax cuts in Arizona over the past few decades that have particularly targeted wealthier Arizonans. And then you watch the tracking of the lowering of educational outcomes like attainment, and then going on for a 2-year or 4-year degree. So reductions in education funding as a result of tax cuts, and then reduction of educational outcomes. And then there's also an uptick in the need for public assistance. So I'm hearing my colleague Dave Wells say causation doesn't mean correlation, but it's an interesting read, and it's hard to think that it doesn't correlate.
Well, and I think you both bring us to a good closing point, and that is you both underscored in so many different ways the critical importance of public schools to our communities and to our kids. And so Save Our Schools Arizona Network will continue working to educate people. We'll continue focusing on all the kids across our state who need us to prioritize public education. And if you want to know more, please visit our website, Save Our Schools Arizona Network. And you can always email me with questions. It's just sharon@sosaznetwork.org. And I'm happy to answer questions. Big thanks to both of you guys. There weren't questions, but there were many comments in the chat thanking you for all of the information and wishing that everybody could hear this. So we will put this up on our YouTube site so that it will be available for people to watch in the
Pleasure to
future.
be
So
here.
thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank
keep
you, and
up the good
thanks.
work, everybody. Take care.
Yeah, so
Take
grateful
care.
for